the system went down, you've got a regulator investigating, you've got your internal or external auditors investigating, and they're not just investigating the conduct, they're investigating how the investigation is being done. It was a huge stress because you've got multiple lenses.
It's interesting you raised that. It's not something I've thought about.
Emma Slatter is a chief officer at Visa, leading legal strategy across the UK and Europe. With more than 6 years at Deutsche Bank, she brings extensive experience in financial services and regulatory law.
Once you've been through these types of situations, you develop yourself. A successful GC is not about the person necessarily themselves. It's how successful you are in leading a team.
As you obviously saw lots of different styles of leadership in your career, including some leaders who were prone to fly off the handle. Did you see how that affected staff?
It's a tough world that you're operating in. So yeah, I've seen a whole variety of different behaviours. And
welcome to Beyond Billables, lessons from top law firm partners, the podcast where we hear from well-known and renowned senior legal practitioners who reveal, hopefully, the secrets of their success. I'm Stephen Rodney, founder of Integrate Coaching, where we produce tailor-made lateral integration programs for partners moving to new firms, and formerly co-founder of Fox Rodney Search. I'm absolutely delighted today that we're joined by a general counsel guest, Emma Slatter, Chief Officer Legal, Regulatory and Compliance for Visa. A very warm welcome, Emma.
thank you very much, Stephen. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So, Emma, can I just start off by asking you a little bit about your journey to becoming a lawyer, initially in private practice, and then your decision to move in-house, and how you became a GC first at Deutsche and then at Visa?
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit of an unexpected path, I guess. I didn't have any great ambitions to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a footballer or a sports journalist, which was my preference. But at the time, my parents, who were both teachers, said, you need to aspire to maybe do something a little more elevated than that. So I went to university and I studied law. And in fact, the only reason I did that was because, not really knowing what to do, I had 5 days in the New Forest with a local authority lawyer, driving around with him in his Robin Reliant as he smoked multiple cigarettes. We visited all sorts of things, from noise abatement orders to a brothel, who knew, in the New Forest. And I thought, well, actually, law seems quite fun. And as I, was a relatively biddable child, I followed my parents' advice and did what was more of a vocational degree. And having then done that, I actually did probably one of the first vacation schemes, and it was at Slaughter and May. I knew nothing about law firms, who was good, who was bad. I was advised that it was sensible to go to London because, if you were going to start off, it was as good a place as any. And having done a vacation scheme at Slaughter and May, and had multiple interviews at other firms, I thought, well, actually, I knew it a little bit. So why not go there? Again, not really knowing much about the reputation, or really having a very clear idea of what I wanted to do, where I wanted to focus. But I knew they were generalists, and that suited me very well. So I was at Slaughters for 6 very interesting, very challenging, and very hardworking years. And again, at a certain point, I thought, I'm just spending too much time at work, and I quite fancy doing something a bit different. And a former colleague at Slaughters was at what was then Morgan Grenfell. They were looking for a lawyer. So he asked me if I'd be interested. And having said yes, that's where I landed. Morgan Grenfell was within 6 months absorbed into Deutsche Bank, who were originally an investor only. And I guess from there, the next 20 years was history.
And you saw an awful lot at Deutsche in that.
And I saw an awful lot in that 20 years. And, one of the things I think that helped me, but made it interesting was the fact that I was always happy to take on whatever got thrown at me. So
Right.
it was a relatively small legal team to begin with. Obviously, at a certain point, there was the bankers' trust integration, so it became a bigger legal team, and it generally evolved. But I'd done everything from employment law to asset management. I'd done commercial law. My generalist backgrounds at Slaughters had really stood me in good stead. And I was always interested to take on new things. For probably the first 6 or 7 years at Deutsche, I did the same thing. I didn't have a team. And then my first big management role came about 6 or 7 years in when I took on head of global markets legal for Deutsche Bank in London. And that was something that was pretty outside my expertise and knowledge. It was more about having a leader to sort of corral together, which was a very high performing team, but quite an aggressive team, and needed somebody that was going to come in and shake it up a bit and really provide leadership and calm leadership in amongst all of the headwinds that were starting to come down the track.
Was that before or after the crash then?
That was just before the crash, yeah. So it's before. But, it was a very, and for a period of time, Deutsche pre-crash and even just after the crash was doing incredibly well, was very successful. It had a unique culture. It was full of very high performing, very interested and interesting people, but an environment that was a little bit more dog eat dog and internally competitive than many other organizations. But I've always had quite a constructive and a calm demeanor, and I think that stood me in good stead to really help myself and the team kind of navigate through what we were being asked to do. And then obviously post financial crisis, moving into a world where a lot of the work that we had been doing, a lot of the transactions, businesses we supported were then being subject of investigations from regulators around the world. So that was in itself an incredibly tough time. But, again, one where we demonstrated resilience and collaboration and support for each other and, worked our way through it.
Yeah,
It was
okay.
probably the toughest time as a lawyer. I mean, there was a lot that wasn't pleasant. To an extent, you were being asked with some of these investigations to review what team members had done. We were the subject to multiple reviews ourselves. The investigation was being investigated by regulators to make sure we were doing everything properly and we weren't trying to sweep anything under the carpet. And at the same time, we were in a situation where, individuals, particularly on the business side, but also within legal and compliance, were being looked at with a view to, potentially taking the rap for, activities that had happened. And so it was really a time of trying to balance the interests of the organization, the interests of colleagues, employees, and also the obligations that you have obviously to regulators and BaFin and whomever.
And so that lasted until when? When did you move on to Visa?
I moved on so it was almost exactly 20 years. In fact, I think pretty much my last day in the office was when the result of the Brexit referendum was announced.
Okay.
And I'd actually, for the previous 6 months, I'd moved away from doing my GC role into a role of providing kind of more strategic advice and support, partly because I was a bit burned out and also because I was thinking, I'm quite keen to do something different. And then after 6 months of doing that, I thought, what I really want to do is just take a break, because I'd gone straight from school to university, straight from university to law college, to Slaughters, to Morgan Grenfell, all the way through. I'd never taken more than probably 2 or 3 weeks holiday maximum. And so I thought, actually, I'm going to take a sabbatical. So I left with a view to doing a year away.
Right.
And then, various headhunters approached me, one of which was the job at Visa. And I remember, number one, thinking, I don't really know anything about Visa. Payments at the time wasn't particularly front and center as it is now. But my boyfriend, who's American, said, look, you'd be foolish not to interview there. It's a fantastic company. So what if it's a bit quiet and dull is good? And besides which, I like where you've been for the past few years. Visa makes money.
Wow.
Yeah,
Be shocked how they make money.
shock horror. Yeah, exactly. But that was a bit of that was, potentially a bit different. Yeah, so I interviewed there, and actually I thought, this sounds fascinating. I contacted a few people that I knew that had worked with Visa and said, what do you think about it? And they said something not dissimilar to what David had said. So I slightly cut short my sabbatical. I had a bit of a tussle with the global GC at Visa, and we came to an accommodation, and I joined, having been told I'd probably find it a bit dull.
Yes.
2 weeks later, I think, 3 weeks later, Visa had their first ever outage and crisis, of which I was very used to at Deutsche Bank, obviously. But whereas in Deutsche, crisis management was something that was very much embedded into banks and whatever. It wasn't really something that was embedded at an organization with Visa that had never had to face it. So I went suddenly into, overnight working somewhere that payments I knew very little about. So I can remember being asked lots of things about, how are we going to get, money movements settled, transactions settled, what's in the rules. And I was thinking, I've no idea. but luckily it was a very good leadership team, great support from externals, but also from the global organization. And we managed our way through it.
Just remind us what that crisis was about.
So we had basically it was a partial failure of a switch, which meant for a period of time the system went down. And as I say, now, of course, crisis management, we do industry-wide, including regulators and whatever, annually under the auspices of the Bank of England. But, we'd only just started being a regulated organisation anyway, a year before I joined. So, yeah, a lot of this was very new. Since then, globally, they had a process anyway. But since then, obviously payments has expanded and the growth of payments, and therefore these type of situations, nothing like that again. But from time to time there are outages, typically not necessarily by Visa, but other organizations, part of the ecosystem, and we cope.
Yeah. So actually, they recruited someone. They probably didn't think about the fact that you were used to sort of crisis management, but it was an advantage.
Yeah, I think it was an advantage from a practical experience sense, but also just from once you've been through these types of situations, you do demonstrate and and you develop yourself, a way of dealing with whether it's resilience, whether it's just, understanding and being able to prioritize, recognizing that, people can be sort of rushing around, but let's just be calm, take a step back. What do we need to do first? What are the main issues? What could be the real downsides, and how are we going to address those? And to some extent, some of the other points can be put to one side.
Yeah.
And we can get to that later.
You've mentioned just in that very helpful introduction, your calmness, leadership skills, resilience. I'm interested from your point of view that there may be some other things as well. And you also mentioned your Generalist background at Slaughters, which I thought was very interesting, and how that may have helped you. So from your side, what is being a successful GC, and how do you think the skills that you possess have helped you become one?
I mean, I think in some ways my approach has always been that one of a successful GC is not about the person necessarily themselves and how successful the individual is. It's how successful you are in leading a team and really creating as good a team as you can.
Mhm.
And, that requires a lot of, dedication, interest in people, ability to mentor and, but also provide, I think, a very practical, pragmatic and commercial approach to things. It's an ability to influence and, but also to welcome different points of view. I mean, if I think about, say, one of the big challenges that everyone's facing at the moment in terms of how AI will
Mhm.
impact the industry, I think it's being humble to realize that something I need to get myself involved in and I need to understand. But actually, some of the people who are going to have the best ideas and are
Mm.
going to be most fluent in the new language and tools and so on are very junior people within the team.
Mhm.
And therefore, providing a platform for them
Mhm.
to come up with ideas and to empower them, the most junior level in the team. I think what I have found at least is that very often they're the people that do come up with that creativity
Mhm.
because they're a little bit more versed in it. And it's
Yes.
having that, humility to recognize that it doesn't have to be a top-down approach. But, obviously I can provide a framework and I can
Mhm.
provide the environment for people to really have that ability to feel that they can take control, they can try new things.
Mhm.
And if they try things that maybe don't work, then, you'll be there to help support and, to provide a certain amount of air cover. So, yeah.
Yes.
So I think there are a number of things like that where I feel that my job is as a GC is really done, where I will go into a talent session and every person that I mention in my team,
Mhm.
the business will say, fantastic, great,
Mhm.
we love them. You know,
Mhm.
I think that's really what you want.
Yes, as opposed to the focus just being on you. No, it shouldn't be. Do you think, you mentioned sort of leadership a couple of times and your ability to influence. So, did you realize those things at Slaughters? I mean, I don't know if, as an associate growing up there, I don't know how much leadership skills are relevant. So I'm interested when you came into Deutsche, I appreciate you worked your way up over a period. When you came to realize that things like leadership and the ability to influence were pretty key to your success and in mentoring your team.
Yeah. And I think being able to challenge people and,
Mm.
but being unafraid to be challenged yourself as
Mhm.
well, I think is
Mhm.
important. In a way, I mean, people say, have you had mentors? And I think the answer is not really. A lot of it has probably just been learning as I've gone and seeing, perhaps taking the best
Mm.
and trying to avoid the worst of people that you see around you.
Right.
And,
Okay.
recognizing, what when I've enjoyed working with people or for people or I've
Mhm.
respected people, why is that? And what are the kind of things that I see them doing, adopt myself or I would adapt, but then take into account. Now, for example, recognizing the fact that once you are leading a team,
Mm.
then you also need to be very visible, not just to the team, but to senior management.
Yeah.
You need to be connected in, having regular catch ups with people to understand, where the business is going, any feedback about your team, but really also helping to promote the team so that, in an organization, say like Deutsche, perhaps a bit less so at Visa, but in Deutsche, where it was incredibly aggressive, we needed to make sure we were there at the table and that we're able to find our way in and be providing good commercial advice, which
Mm.
was supporting the organization
Mm.
and, recognizing how we could deal with some, incredibly clever but, as I say, very aggressive people
Mm.
who are
Mm.
under a lot of pressure. So you've got to
Mm.
understand where they're coming from and try and, not be the just say no, but kind of saying no in a way that sounds as though you're saying yes or you're
Yeah.
saying possibly. But just trying to find, obviously for some things, and
Mm.
same with Visa, you are saying really don't think that's a great idea.
Mm.
But very often in the end, it's a business decision. It's a commercial decision. And, it's rare to see things that are absolutely illegal. And most of it is more of a judgment. And so, again, having the confidence and the experience to be able to assess where kind of the risk lies and to be able to defend it, but also to understand when it's, the business may have a different view, and that's okay.
I'm interested, and I think hopefully you can talk about this because it's at Deutsche. I won't ask you about Visa. Having gone through, there's been books written about Deutsche and all sorts of things. Having gone through all those years, what are the standout kind of crisis moments that, if you had to think of a couple, which are the ones you'd think about?
I mean, I think, so in maybe more generic terms,
Yeah.
I think it was the most challenging were the ones where, for example, you've got an investigation by the FCA into the FX market. Deutsche was was the biggest FX house.
Yeah.
So the assumption was that we would have bad practices, that there would be things going on within that business that, in whether it was individuals, it might have been individuals, somewhat supported or encouraged by management. And regulators were looking into it, whether it was the FCA, whether it was BaFin, whether it was the regulators in the US. And this wasn't just FX business, it was lots of different businesses post-financial crisis. And I think for me, it was really being in that sort of maelstrom where you've got a regulator investigating, you've got your internal or external auditors investigating, and they're not just investigating the conduct, they're investigating how the investigation is being done, because it's an internal investigation. And then they're also investigating, as part of the internal and the external investigation, actions that either I myself have done, advice I've given, or people within my team. And they're investigating, obviously, business people, say in FX. I mean, I say FX because actually, having gone through it, FX was one where we got pretty much a clean bill of health. I think not surprising to me, because it was an extremely well-run business and very well-respected people who ran it. But, I think probably a surprise if you looked at it externally and objectively. But it was a huge stress because you've got multiple lenses on what you're doing. And that included the supervisory board, because it was under pressure itself. So they were sending in their own audit team to look at what we were doing. And in some cases, obviously, I think probably looking for scapegoats. And so one is trying to do the right thing for the organization, the right thing for the team, the right thing for individuals, including oneself, trying to balance it and be as objective as you can with all of those different perspectives.
Yeah, and the ability to be calm under pressure must be absolutely crucial in that kind of maelstrom that you've described. Were you aware that was an asset you had from the time at Slaughters, or did that kind of surprise you that you were calm under pressure?
I mean, I'm not terribly introspective. Probably, and maybe that's why I'm calm under pressure. I don't know. I'm not really somebody who looks particularly internally. I am who I am. But yeah, I think that probably is, even if I'm not calm, I think I can portray a calm demeanor, which is part of it. I mean, I think, even if inside you're thinking, this is awful, you don't want the people around you to be thinking, oh no, look, Emma's losing it, so something's obviously gone wrong.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I would say that I think as a senior leader, you can also show vulnerability.
Yes.
And so if I wouldn't say that I'm a relatively open person, and therefore, I'm quite open with my team. So if I'm finding things difficult, or if I don't know the answer to something or what have you, I will, be open about that. But I think that's just trying to get that balance so that you can do that in a way which I think gives people a level of confidence or feels that they're, able to give something to you and be supporting to you. But you don't want them to, look at me and think, if she's panicking, then I should be panicking. So,
And did you think, in terms of leadership, I mean, maybe at Deutsche and at Visa as well, and Slaughters, you obviously saw lots of different styles of leadership in your career, including, I suspect, particularly at Deutsche, some leaders were prone to fly off the handle. Did you see how that affected staff for the better or more likely for the worse?
I think in any organization, there are, people react differently to pressure, and it's investment banking, payments now, and being a law partner or whatever. It's a tough world that you're operating in. And so, yeah, I've seen a whole variety of different behaviors, and, some of it very good, some of it, pretty awful. And so I think you kind of learn by it. What I've always tried to do is, to some extent, understand that people have their own pressures, and therefore somebody may be reacting badly, but rather than completely write them off or just, react very negatively to that, for me, it's always been about trying to get on the same wavelength to some extent, or try and diffuse a situation and then try and work through it. It's not always possible, but I think very often it can be. And I've always thought it's much better, and it's not a weakness or wanting everyone to love you, but I think it's always just better if people get on with each other and kind of have a respect for each other and like each other. People work better together in that environment because they will be more open, particularly, say, if they've made a mistake or they're facing a challenge, than they would do if they think you're just going to wrap them over the knuckles. Or, as I say, if you're just going to say no. It doesn't always work, and some people are not completely beyond redemption, but I wouldn't necessarily want to spend my time with. But on the other hand, again, I don't think you want people necessarily to feel that.
Yes. No, I do understand that. So do you think, and I appreciate you haven't yourself been a law firm partner, but looking, you've seen a lot of law firm partners in action, both when you worked with them and since you've been a GC. So do you think there are different skills to be a successful law firm partner as opposed to a GC, or are they pretty similar?
I think the core skills are the same. I mean, obviously the role is different, and the basis on which you're providing advice, is different. But I think good law firm partners, when they're dealing with either their own teams or clients, it's not that different. The skills, I don't think. And, luckily we have some extremely good law firms that we work with, and we do spend quite a lot of time. There is something called the Mindful Business Charter, which was set up principally for the legal industry, about trying to put the right kind of behaviors in place
Okay.
for clients and advisors and that relationship. And that's something, at Deutsche we tried to do, probably less easy to do in many of those types of examples. It was working overnight, or you were having to get things in and very, fixed deadlines and so on. Having said which, at Visa, increasingly it's very similar in terms of just the commercial pressures and the speed of change and so on. But nevertheless, I try to, and my team try very much when we're engaging with our external counsel, to do so in a way which recognises the fact that, we're dealing with people in the same way, and we need to be thoughtful as to what we're asking them to do, what the time frame is, be very clear in our instructions, and, again, to feel that, we're getting the right quality of person, the right kind of advice. And if sometimes the advice is difficult for us to hear, that's fine as well.
And so do you, in terms of that, what was the charter called? The Mindful Business Charter, right. Do you, looking at that and looking at the fact you obviously work both with UK and US law firms or international ones. Do you see a different mindset amongst those firms, or do you think they've kind of merged into one now?
Yeah, I think it very much depends on the firm. I think there probably, there's still a huge amount of pressure
Mm.
on law firms and working within that environment. I think that's partly why, we've always been very successful in the candidates that whether it was at Deutsche or now at Visa, we've hired, because I think people still enjoy the in-house experience and find that there are lots of differences and benefits to being in that environment from being in a law firm. But I think increasingly the idea that it's a much easier place to work or it's much less pressurized isn't the case. I mean, I think for these organizations, it's as pressurized, but I think there is still an element of where you do have a bit more control over what you're doing, and being on the inside with your clients, I think is very helpful because, again, there's always some pushback and, some pretty tough conversations that you have, but you're all working within that same organization. Whereas when
Yes.
you've got an external advisor, it is a more remote relationship.
Yeah, no, I understand that. How do you think law firms? Obviously, I come from a recruitment background, not anymore, but I was always interested to see how law firms handle communication issues with their clients when partners working for those clients departed, and I wasn't necessarily impressed with it. And I was just thinking, how did you find that when that happened, when partners that you knew went to another firm? How did the departing law firm handle that?
I think I must say, it hasn't happened a lot for us. In some respects, I think it has been more about changes in teams, where because we've developed very strong relationships, not just at partner level, but at, senior lawyer level, we've had a lot of secondees who've then gone back to their firms and have continued to work for us, whether that was at Deutsche or Visa, obviously some of whom we've also hired ourselves. But I think generally it's probably handled better now than it was. And perhaps that's because people moving firms has been more common. Increasingly, people do move around and move around probably more often. The days of somebody being, their man and boy
Yeah.
or woman and girl are perhaps much less than they were. And that's to some extent the US influence. And that's probably not a bad thing. As I say, when we have had it happen, it's actually generally, I think it's been done in a pretty open and constructive way.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. Can I just touch, as you know, I now, as I said in the introduction, I now help on the integration front with mainly law firm laterals. And I'm interested from your point of view, firstly, how long do you think it took to you to adapt to the demands of being an in-house lawyer when you left Slaughters? And how well were you integrated on the move to Deutsche, considering it was such a big move? And then, when you moved on to Visa, obviously you explained before you had a crisis in the first 2 or 3 weeks. So you had to get yourself very familiar with the new rules. But how well were those integrations carried out from your point of view?
It was a long time ago. I mean,
I realise
the
that.
move from private practice to Morgan Grenfell, then Deutsche, as it became.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember that. I think I'm pretty adaptable. And because, again, because of the generalist background and the fact that I'd done a lot of different things at Slaughters, within a commercial legal framework, meant that I found it, I liked doing new things and I liked sort of being challenged or just being thrown something to do. And I think I was pretty good, easy person to have because I would, pretty much take on whatever I was asked to do and, give it a good go. And then so then obviously Deutsche, I changed roles, but again, that was internal. So I think it was sort of,
That's different.
it happened more easily. It's different. So the major shift was when I went to Visa. And I think Visa has a reputation, and it had then, of being a very collaborative, although it's a huge US company and it's a very profitable one. It was, when I joined, for its size and its market capitalization, it was a very small number of people, relatively speaking. It's grown significantly in the past 3 or 4 years, but it still had that environment of being, there were people there that were payments experts and had been in payments all of their careers and kind of knew everything about everything. And it was a very supportive organization. I remember actually one of the first conversations I'd had with the global head of HR for the function. He said, "I'm just calling you to welcome you to Visa and just say I'm around, and if there's anything I can do to help at any time, you just need to ask, because we're invested in your success, and this is an important hire. We've made the right thing, but we want to make you love us as much as we're looking forward to loving you." And I just thought, this is amazing. I was kind of thinking, well, where's the catch? At what point is somebody going to come and jump out and say, "Aha, surprise"? So and Visa, I think, has remained very much like that. That it's somewhere that really cares about its people. And as the environment has changed, it's become perhaps a bit more commercial. It was always commercially driven, but it's become, there's more of a sales focus, for example. There's more of a, that investment banking ethos to an extent. But I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
No.
Because it's still managing to balance its core values and the leadership principles and things that it really stands by. And, what it sees as it can contribute to, economies, growth, etc. But nevertheless, the environment is, economically it's challenging. And within payments, there are lots more competitors and competitive ways of paying than there had been for years and years and years. But I think the sign of a great organization is that it can adapt like that, and it can, maintain what perhaps differentiates itself from other organizations, whilst, becoming more cut and thrust.
Yeah. Just before we move on, because you mentioned AI a couple of times, I'd like to come back to it, but just before we do that, you've mentioned a couple of times about your Generalist background at Slaughters. And I always found as a recruiter that Slaughters were wonderful at helping their senior associates, whether those senior associates wanted to be a partner or didn't want to be a partner, but they weren't going to be a partner, to move to in-house roles, and as well as joining law firms. I always did wonder, with the way Slaughters works with the generalist background, does help you adapt quicker. I'm just interested what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it definitely, from my perspective, it did. That's why I enjoyed being there, because, it was, being a Slaughters was tough, because they put up very junior lawyers against partners from other firms. And, I remember I was only 1 or 2 years qualified, possibly. I was doing the acquisition of a big power station up against a partner from, I can't remember whether it's Allen Overy or somewhere. And I mean, I was really a bit, I wasn't completely left without supervision, but more or less. And I was really having to just kind of blag my way to some extent through. But luckily, I had a very good very senior in-house counsel at the power station that we were selling, who was quite helpful to me as I was struggling.
Well, they probably could see that you were struggling.
Probably see I was struggling a little bit, yes. But I suspect the partner on the other side the same. But so yeah, I think it was, but it was a good thing, because I think often, you can, it's fine to be specialized, of course, and specialism doesn't mean to say that it's not specialized within what's quite a, broad area. But for me personally, I liked the fact that I was doing different things, and I think that definitely gives you the ability, as law evolves and as organisations evolve, to be adaptable and to think, a bit creatively, because situations come up, and I guess the economy changes, and the ability, therefore, to you may be working in an area which becomes much less busy, in which case the ability to then go and work on something else, which is really the hot area. It's not always possible to do that, but I think where you can, then it's great. It's a great experience.
Good. And that transaction obviously completed successfully, did it? The one you...
I think so. Well, I don't know what success meant in that context, but yes, the sale happened.
Excellent.
And I wasn't. I have had occasions where I've been having to look back at my own documents and thinking, "Oh, I really hope that I've got this right." Particularly during the .com period at Deutsche, where we were buying companies, and that was one of the roles that I was doing. So it was very exciting. We were engaging with all of these new upcoming companies, including one where I remember going to a dinner with a company that we were thinking of investing in that did some, techie thing. And the CEO, they were all very young, and the CEO almost choked on a piece of sushi. One of my colleagues had to do the Heimlich maneuver.
Oh my God.
And I remember a bit later in the discussion speaking to the guy who was the CFO, and he pointed over and he said, "Look over there." And I said, "Oh, I can see some bright lights." He said, "Yes, that's a big fun fair." He said, "I can't believe it. A year ago, I was doing the roller coaster or something. I was roller coaster operative, and here I am." And I thought at that point, I'm not sure you should have told me this, given that we were potentially going to invest. But I'm beginning to have doubts that this is the right acquisition we should be making. And in fact, that was one we did pass on.
Well, you did pass that.
Others.
It's interesting, actually. I keep talking about your pack of documents. I was a lawyer a long time ago. I always remember, it was in the late 80s, it was a very busy time. I always remember a partner that I worked for. Actually, it was a partner someone else worked for. He'd been up 2 nights on a deal, 2 consecutive nights. And they'd done the deal, put everything away. And then he'd had to later on kind of take them out, not because anything had gone wrong, just because he was doing something a few weeks later. And he admitted to the trainee that was working for him the documents didn't make sense. And so nothing went wrong because the drafting was terrible by the second night and everyone was just asleep. And I always remember thinking, blimey, that's just a complete waste of money, isn't it? Making everyone work that hard, produce rubbish work.
And also you realise, so for example, you'd spend forever, because there were a lot of acquisitions going on, all joint venture agreements, and you'd have these complicated joint venture provisions on termination and what have you. And of course, what happened when we did end up having to unwind some of this stuff was just people just came to an agreement, and you barely looked at the documents at all. But I was always slightly put off. It was a lesson that I was always thinking about by somebody, and this may have been apocryphal, but was drafting a loan agreement and forgot the repayment clause. And I thought, that was that's not ideal. So I was used quite, let's check again, check some of these core things, because you can get into the detail and forget the bigger picture.
You would forget the wood for the trees. Yeah, no, I'm sure. Emma, you did mention AI. I'm interested in looking at the factors that are going to affect both how GCs operate in the future and how their relationship with law firms might change going forward. And obviously AI is one of those factors. I'm interested if there's any others. And also, it would be interesting to hear if a law firm you deal with takes P investment, which it might happen, whether that would bother you professionally. Or, there's a few things there for you to comment on.
I mean, AI definitely is going to be impactful. I think it's still unclear quite how impactful it's going to be. And I find some of the discussion around, you're not going to need junior lawyers anymore. I think, well, in which case, then how do you get your senior lawyers
Yeah,
if you've got
indeed.
no junior? So, I mean, it's going to make a difference as to what those lawyers actually do to train, and thought needs to be given to that. But if I think about some of my original, and this obviously is a long time ago, but I was colouring plans and I was checking, with a ruler, reading out
Yeah.
documents. So we were checking. I mean, I'm not sure that made me a better lawyer, being not, colouring a plan and not going over the border to demean the property to somebody else that wasn't
Yeah.
supposed to have it. So I think in some respects it will be a good thing, because actually juniors will need to still learn, but they'll be learning on things that are probably more relevant
Yes.
to them. And they're being able to use tools that are really helping them, to get through the kind of cruddy stuff and get to the really interesting value add. Now, as to whether you may need fewer, that's a different question. So I think there's a lot that's going to be very positive, and, we're trying out much of this at Visa. We have a lot of, we've got our own versions of ChatGPT and other things, because we're partnering with Microsoft and what have you.
Yeah.
And we're doing a lot internally. But, I'm not sure as yet that I mean, obviously payments, it may change as well. A lot of what we're doing, agentic commerce, and that's one of the big things we're looking at, how you deal with stable coins and so on. But in terms of what we do day to day, I think, we're still working our way through it, but we see, some real positives. In terms of the relationship with the law firms on this, it will change the model to an extent, because there'll definitely be, I mean, some law firms were a little bit secretive to begin with as to which tools they may be using or not. But I think the good ones have very quickly realized that, everybody's going to be doing it. So rather than try and be a bit cute, let's think about, well, how do you start to have a different approach in terms
Yeah.
of what are our expectations as to their use of AI, and then what that flows through into the billing.
Yes.
And I guess in some respects, what will happen, I think, is that you will end up not charging for certain things, but then maybe the charge actually goes into what's more important, which is the value add and the strategic thinking and the constructive thinking and so on.
You're going to look for that more strategic thinking, because you're going to realize that certain tasks, maybe some of your external lawyers do, you can do in-house now more easily.
Or they can do it more easily using AI themselves, and therefore we're not necessarily going to charge for
Yeah.
that time.
I think that
Or
would be
if they
very
want to
interesting.
do it without AI, that's fine. But then equally, we're not going to charge for it. So, but I think that we've started having these conversations with our key law firm partners, and I think that's the way to deal with it, to really be open about it, because ultimately it should get to a model which benefits both sides. And, as I say, our good law firms have been saying to us, look, we're using these tools. We're thinking these are great. These aren't so good. These might be useful for you. And, let's think about that. And let's think about the billing implications and what you're prepared to have us charge and not, as the case may be.
I think it's a very interesting area. In fact, there was an article today in the FT about KPMG. I don't know whether you saw it, because I think they're under pressure on their own audits with clients to reduce their fees because of AI. I don't know how this come out. They've got I think they use Grant Thornton for their own audit, KPMG do, and they've put a lot of pressure on Grant Thornton to reduce the costs on what they're charging KPMG for their audit because of the use of AI.
Everybody's going to be doing it.
Everyone's going to be doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big sort of future issue to address. I mean, I think in no particular order, the generational changes, I think, will have an impact as well. And perhaps law firms might be slightly less so, or it might take a bit longer to flow through. But, we can, I mean, a lot of it is very positive. I mean, I think people being prepared to challenge a bit more junior people. I mean, I like to feel that they always would do in our firm, but also just having a different view in terms of not less hardworking. I haven't noticed that, but having other interests, wanting to get involved in different things. We have a very strong pro bono and kind of associated programs that my team in particular at Visa is known as being one of the most active, one of the most impactful. And, that's something we really encourage. I mean, I'm always amazed how my teams find the time to actually do all of these extra things at the same time as what they're doing, in their day-to-day work. But, again, I think it's being open to that and to trying to help, support that kind of environment. And also there are clearly people are less inclined to be at organizations, for a long period of time,
Yes.
and after 1 or 2 years, they're kind of, what's next?
Yeah.
When's my promotion? Or, I'd like to do something different. I kind of feel I've done that. And you think, what have you? You've not been doing it for long. But, I totally get that. And I think it's something that we need to be thinking more about. And, how do we support that and encourage it?
Okay.
But also ensure that it works within the constraints that we operate.
And the P point I raised about whether that would cause you any concern if a law firm that you give work to takes P as an investment. Have you thought about that?
I can't say it's not something that's come up yet, really. So it's an interesting question. I suspect it would be one of those things that's maybe more likely to start, perhaps not, but start in US and then come through.
I think it might actually be the other way around, actually, because I think it's much harder for a P to invest in US law firms than in the UK. So I think more like to start over here.
I don't know how we'd think about that. As I say, it isn't something that we've had to think. We'd be spending more of our time in relation to litigation funders than
Oh, okay. And what are your views on
anything
them?
else. I don't know. I mean, obviously, you can have as Visa. I don't think we think they're a good thing at all. But that may be different from whether you think from it's a fact of life. I think it has class actions, and the class action regime is still having its teething troubles. I can certainly see why it's thought to be a good thing to open access to legal redress and so on. But I do think that the way it's operating at the moment isn't brilliant. And we're definitely seeing that there are examples where we might have settled things and it hasn't happened
Right.
because of that funding element to it. And I think
You've
that's
actually seen
one
that,
of
have you?
And I think there's also, I see the fact that where you are having, it's fine if you're doing a class action on behalf of, individuals that might not otherwise get access to justice. But when you're then having class actions that are class actions on behalf of, big companies, I can see why that whole opt-in versus opt-out needs to be, approached in the right way, because it does seem to me that it makes no sense for it to be opt-out where you've got, big organizations that will be making their own decisions and could take litigation perfectly well themselves.
Yeah. It's interesting you raised that. It's not something I've thought about. It, obviously affects you guys a lot at the moment and other organizations.
Yeah, starting to, and I think it's going to be it's definitely going to be a way of the future.
So I've got one final question before we finish off. If you had your time again, would you do anything differently as a GC or a lawyer? I was thinking, actually, if you had your time now, you could be a female footballer. And your parents might be fine with it.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't have had to. I applied to the Bobby Charlton soccer school and was told I couldn't because I was a girl. And I had to stop playing in the boys' school team at age 12 because boys and girls weren't allowed to play together at the time.
So,
I was that age,
so leaving aside the fact you might have been a successful footballer rather than a lawyer, if you had your time again, would you do anything differently as a lawyer?
Honestly, I don't really know. I don't think I mean, I might have done different type of law, but I must say, even through the down times and not so good times, I've met great people. I've had really interesting experiences. They've been challenging, some have been good, some have been bad, but I think all of them contribute to, resilience. And, I've learned a lot, and not everything's been enjoyable, but much of it has been. I'm not unhappy that I chose to be a lawyer. And as I say, I've had some fantastic experiences and met some brilliant people and very clever people, really interesting people, done fascinating deals, been part of the big things during the financial crisis that people are still litigating now.
Yeah, they are indeed.
And, being at Visa, I was a torchbearer at the Paris Olympics. That mightn't have happened otherwise.
Tell everyone that, which you told me now, pre-discussion, I'd forgotten that, why would you do anything differently if you weren't going to be able to do that? If you'd missed out on that, what an amazing thing to do.
It was fantastic. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think so. That might be very boring. But there were lots of things I could have done, because I have lots of interest. But, it was calmer, and I'm fine with that.
Good. Well, Emma, that's been really very, very interesting and absolutely fascinating to hear your story and about, how you came to be where you are, what you've gone through and your views on things going forward. I hope our audience is going to really appreciate that. And I'm sure both law firm partners and other GCs will be fascinated to hear it. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and making the time to speak to us. So join us on our next episode of Beyond Billables Lessons from Top Law Firm Partners, where we'll have another successful senior legal practitioner who will hopefully reveal the secrets of their success. See you next time.